There are moments in life when the fabric of what we call reality tears just enough for something to slip through. Something that doesn't belong. It shouldn't exist. That watches us from the corner of a room we've lived in for years and waits. Not with the cheap thrill of a jump scare, but with a patience that is ancient and hungry and utterly indifferent to our disbelief. I'm talking about true horror, the kind that happens to real people in real places, leaving scars that don't show on skin. Tonight you're going to hear 3 accounts that were never meant to be told, pulled from the whispers of those who survived and the silence of those who didn't. These stories will take you deep into a Louisiana bayou, where the water itself has a memory and a man discovered his own reflection wasn't his anymore. Across the searing red dirt emptiness of the Australian outback, where a young woman on a solo drive found that the road home had been erased. And onto a wind-scoured Scottish island, where a family learned that their ancestral home was keeping something far older than ghosts in the walls. These narratives aren't fiction dressed up as truth. They are the dark, unvarnished testimonies of people whose lives were split in two before and after by forces that refuse to be categorized. If you've ever felt a presence in an empty house, caught a movement in the corner of your eye that dissolved when you turned, or driven a road that suddenly felt wrong in a way you couldn't name, then you're already part of this. Stay with me. By the time the final word settles, you'll understand that the most terrifying question isn't what if, it's what is still waiting. If you're ready to face the unexplainable, slam that like button, subscribe with all notifications, and comment right now with the single word that scares you most. Water, isolation, or the past. I read every single response, and your own true story might be the next one I share. Harlan DeWitt had grown up on the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, hearing stories about the Rougarou and the lights that danced over the swamp at night. But he'd always dismissed them as old folks' tales meant to keep children from wandering too close to the black water. And now, at 34, returning to his late grandmother's house in Pier Part to settle her estate. Those stories felt as distant as his childhood, the house sinking into the mud on cypress stilts, the air thick with the smell of decay and jasmine. The first night, as he sorted through a stack of yellowed envelopes in the attic, he heard a splash from the bayou behind the property, a heavy, deliberate sound. Not the quick plop of a garfish, but something large, submerging and then rising again. And when he aimed his flashlight out the window, the beam caught the surface of the water just as it was smoothing over, rings spreading outward from a dark absence that seemed deeper than the surrounding murk. He shrugged it off as a gator, but the next morning he found a set of wet footprints on the wooden porch. Prints that were too long and too narrow, with an extra digit splayed to the side, and they led from the water's edge to the back door and then simply stopped, as if whatever made them had pressed itself against the wall and vanished. That afternoon, while cleaning out the crawl space under the house, Harlan discovered a jar filled with a cloudy liquid and what looked like strands of human hair, along with a small, leather-bound journal that belonged to his grandmother. Its pages filled with the same phrase written over and over in a hand that started neat and gradually became a frantic scrawl. The reflection is not you. The reflection is not you. The reflection is not you. A cold weight settled in his stomach, and he began to notice things he'd ignored before. All the mirrors in the house had been turned to face the wall, their backs dusty and draped with rosaries. And the only photograph of his grandfather that remained was a tintype in which the man's eyes had been scratched out with a pin. That evening, determined to shake the unease, Harlan sat on the porch with a bottle of bourbon, watching the sun bleed into the cypress trees. And he must have dozed off because he woke to total darkness, and the sound of someone humming a lullaby he recognized from his childhood, a tune his grandmother used to sing when she rocked him on this very porch. The melody drifting across the water in a voice that was hers, but distorted, as if it were coming through a throat filled with swamp water. He stumbled inside, heart hammering, and caught his reflection in the dark screen of the microwave, and his reflection was not looking at him. It was facing slightly away. Its mouth moving, its eyes fixed on something over its own shoulder. And when Harlan spun around, there was nothing there, but the humming had stopped, and the silence was replaced by a wet, dragging sound on the porch stairs. He locked the door, something he'd never done in this house, and spent the night in the living room with every light on. But at 3:17 a.m., the power flickered and died, and he heard the back door, which he had bolted, creak open with the slow patience of a breath. And from the kitchen came the soft, deliberate sound of a wet foot on linoleum. Harlan grabbed a cast-iron skillet and crept down the hallway, the darkness so complete it felt like fabric against his face. And when he rounded the corner into the kitchen, he saw it. A figure standing at the sink, tall and thin, with skin that gleamed like the belly of a catfish in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. Its back to him, its head tilted at an angle that made his neck ache in sympathy. And it was holding one of the mirrors his grandmother had hidden, peering into it with an intensity that was almost reverent. He must have made a sound because the figure's head swiveled, not turned. Swiveled, and he saw its face, which was his own face, the same stubble on the jaw, the same scar on the brow, but the eyes were inverted, the pupils white and the sclera black, and the mouth was stretched into a smile that he knew his own muscles couldn't make. The thing spoke, and its voice was a perfect mimicry of his own, but layered with a wet, gurgling undercurrent, and it said, "I've been wearing your grandmother's face for years, but yours fits so much better." And then it stepped forward, and the light from the moon caught something on the floor. Dozens of jars, just like the one he'd found, each containing hair that matched the heads of every family member whose portrait hung in the house. Harlan did the only thing his body would allow. He ran, not out the door, but up the stairs into the attic, barricading himself behind his grandmother's old hope chest. And from below he heard the thing moving through the house, opening doors with a gentle, almost tender creak, calling his name in his own voice, saying things only he knew, the name of his first dog, the city where he'd proposed to his ex-wife, the secret he'd whispered to his dying mother. And it was this intimacy, this violation of his own memory, that finally broke him. He stayed in the attic until dawn, and when the sun came through the slats, he crept down to find the house empty. The mirrors all turned back to face the room, and in every single one, his reflection was grinning at him, even though his own lips were pressed tight. He left that day with nothing but the clothes on his back, and he spent the last 6 years moving from one rental to another. But the thing has followed him, not always, just often enough. Appearing in the background of photos, in the reflective surface of a train window, in the black glass of his phone when the screen goes dark. Harlan told me that once, in a motel in Texas. He woke to find the mirror above the sink fogged with moisture and a message written in the condensation. You can't outrun a reflection. He no longer owns any mirrors, but he still catches glimpses of himself in shop windows, and his reflection is always a step behind. Its smile a little wider, its eyes a little more inverted. And he knows that one day he's going to turn around and find nothing there because the thing in the mirror will have finally stepped through. And on that day, Harlan DeWitt will become another jar under a house in the Bayou, another voice humming a lullaby across the black water. Zara Kincaid had made the drive from Kalgoorlie to Meekatharra a half-dozen times for her work as a geologist. Always alone, always with a full tank and extra water and a satellite phone she'd never had to use. But on this trip, the outback felt different from the moment she turned off the Great Eastern Highway and onto the unsealed track that would take her north through the red heart of the Murchison. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the roof of her Land Cruiser, and the radio picked up nothing but a low, rhythmic hum that wasn't quite static. It had a pattern, a pulse, as if the earth itself were broadcasting something in a frequency just below hearing. By midday, the sky had turned a strange, brassy color, the kind of yellow that old-timers said meant a dust storm was coming. But the air was utterly still, and the red dirt ahead shimmered into mirages that looked solid enough to touch. She noticed the first car around 2 o'clock. An old Holden Ute, faded blue, parked on the shoulder with its bonnet up, and a figure standing beside it, waving slowly. Arm rising and falling with the mechanical regularity of a metronome. Zara slowed, instinct and a dozen outback survival courses telling her to be cautious. And as she got closer, the details resolved. The car was rusted through, its tires long flat, and the figure was not a person but a scarecrow. Dressed in a flannel shirt and jeans, a burlap sack for a head, and the arm that waved was tied to a stick with baling twine. But the wind wasn't blowing, and the arm was still moving, a slow, deliberate arc that made the hair on her arms stand up. She drove on, faster now, telling herself it was a prank set up by station kids. But 10 kilometers later, she passed another car, this one a burned-out sedan, its paint blistered and standing in the front seat. Pressed against the windshield was a figure that looked at first like a charred body, but resolved into another scarecrow. This one with a face painted on the burlap in bright red, a face that was screaming. The track stretched on, the sun sinking, and Zara checked her GPS only to find the screen flickering. The map showing her location as a point that was simultaneously stationary and sliding sideways. Glitch she'd never seen before. And then the screen went black, and the satellite phone refused to power on, even with a fresh battery. She was alone now in a way that city people never experience. No signal, no backup. No one who knew her route, the outback spreading around her like a rust-colored ocean that had swallowed everything but this one thin ribbon of dirt. As dusk fell, she came to a crossroads that she knew shouldn't exist because there were no crossroads on this track. Just a straight shot to the highway, yet here it was, a perfect intersection of 2 dirt roads. And in the center stood a pole with signs pointing in 4 directions, each one reading the same word. Onward. She took the track that should have been north, but the landscape began to repeat with a precision that was impossible, the same twisted mulga tree, the same scatter of bleached sheep bones, the same rusted oil drum with a hole in its side that she'd passed an hour ago. And Zara realized with a rising tide of dread that she was driving in a loop, something the Australian outback, its immutable geology, simply didn't allow. She stopped the car and stepped out into a silence so complete it rang in her ears like a bell, and in that silence, she heard it. A low, droning engine, far away but approaching, the sound of a vehicle coming up the track behind her. When she squinted into the dying light, she saw headlights. 2 points of yellow that wobbled slightly. She felt a surge of relief that collapsed into ice when the vehicle crested a rise, and she saw it was her own Land Cruiser. Identical in every detail except it was covered in a thick coat of red dust, and the windscreen was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, and the driver behind the steel wheel was a scarecrow wearing her jacket, her hat, her sunglasses. Its burlap head turned to face her with a painted smile that was too wide and too knowing. Zara scrambled back into her car, hands shaking so hard she could barely turn the key, and drove the opposite direction, the headlights of the other vehicle swiveling to follow her. And the track bent in ways that defied physics, curving back on itself until she was driving beside her own dust trail, chasing her own taillights. The two vehicles paralleling each other on a road that was suddenly doubling like a mirror image. And in the other Land Cruiser, the scarecrow was matching her speed, its burlap head bobbing with each bump, its painted eyes somehow fixed on her. She drove until the fuel light came on, and then she kept driving because stopping felt like surrender. And the sky wheeled through a night that lasted only 2 hours before the sun rose in the west, a bloody red disk that seemed to be watching her. And the landscape changed again, becoming a salt pan so vast and white it hurt to look at. And in the center of the pan stood a figure that was not a scarecrow, but a woman. Her skin sun-browned and her hair bleached white, wearing a dress made of stitched-together grain sacks, and she was holding a sign that read, Zara Kincaid, 2026. The woman smiled, and the smile was the same one painted on the scarecrow's face. And she spoke in a voice that was Zara's own, a perfect recording, saying, "You've been on this road a very long time, and you'll be on it a while longer, because the outback doesn't let go of what it claims." Zara's memory fractures at this point. She remembers driving, remembers the sun moving in wrong arcs, remembers passing the same scarecrow-filled cars over and over. But the next clear thing is waking up in the driver's seat with the engine dead and the Land Cruiser half buried in a dune. A hand-painted sign by the road ahead reading, "Welcome to Wailuna," even though Wailuna was 400 kilometers from where she should have been. And the date on her watch showed 3 days had passed, but the fuel tank was still a quarter full, as if she'd only just set out. She was found by a road crew, dehydrated and sunburned, but alive. And she told them about the scarecrows and the loop and the woman, and they nodded and said the outback played tricks on the mind. But one of them, an old Aboriginal man, looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and said quietly, "You walked the song line that wasn't meant for you." And something on the other side noticed. Zara moved to Melbourne and got a desk job, but she tells me that every time she drives outside the city, even for a day trip, the GPS will occasionally flicker and show a route that doesn't exist, a road looping back on itself into a red center that pulses like a heartbeat. And she knows that somewhere out there a Land Cruiser with a scarecrow driver is still circling, still waiting for her to come back and finish the loop. And the scariest part is that sometimes when she's very tired, she wants to. Finlay Macrae had inherited Tainah Stash, the House of the Fairies, his family's croft on the Trotternish Peninsula, from an uncle he'd met only twice. And when he arrived on the Isle of Skye in a drizzle that felt more like a living mist, the cottage was exactly as he'd imagined. Whitewashed stone, a slate roof sagging like the back of an old horse, and a view of the Sound of Rosse that would have been beautiful if the sea hadn't been the color of a bruise, and the clouds hadn't been sitting so low they seemed to be breathing against the windows. The solicitor had mentioned in passing that the house had a room that was kept locked. A gable room at the top of a narrow stair that the uncle had sealed off with 3 deadbolts and a sheet of iron. And Finlay, being a rational man who worked in IT in Glasgow, assumed it was a dodgy floor or an asbestos concern. and put the keys in his pocket with every intention of dealing with it later. It's the first night, as he was boiling water for tea on the ancient Aga, he heard a sound from upstairs that was so out of place it took him a moment to identify it. The slow, deliberate creak of a rocking chair, a rhythm of wood on wood that had no business in a house with no rocking chair. And when he climbed the stairs, the sound stopped, as if it had been waiting for him, leaving a silence that was thick with the sense of something holding its breath just on the other side of the wall. He tried the door to the Gable room locked, solid, the iron sheet cold to the touch, and pressed his ear against it. And he heard what he would later describe as a room full of whispers. Too many voices to count, all speaking in a language that wasn't Gaelic or English or anything he recognized, a language that sounded like wind and stones and the spaces between heartbeats. And underneath it all, a low, steady hum that vibrated through the door and into his skull. Finlay retreated to the kitchen and told himself it was the pipes, the wind, his imagination. But over the following days, the phenomena escalated. Objects in the main room were rearranged into patterns when he awoke. Spirals and concentric circles made from cutlery and stones, and once from his own hair. The radio would turn on by itself in the dead of night. Always tuned to static, and in that static he began to hear fragments of what sounded like his own voice speaking backwards. Words he'd said years ago in private conversations. Secrets that had never left his own head. And then the Gable room started to dream. That was the only way he could describe it. He would sit in the living room and suddenly know, with the certainty of memory, that the room above him was full of light, a cold blue light that pulsed like a jellyfish. And that something inside was awake and aware of him, waiting with an anticipation that felt ancient and hungry and oddly tender, as if it had been waiting for a Macrae to come home for a very long time. He began to research Thai na SDH, digging through parish records and old stories at the Portree Library. And what he found made his blood run cold. The croft had been built in 1782 on the site of a much older structure that the locals had called, in CMR Falatched, the Hidden Room. And for 2 centuries, every Macrae who had lived there had eventually sealed the Gable room and fled, leaving behind journals that spoke of a tenant that predated the house, a presence that had been bound to the land by something the old Highland folk called the Squithchum, the fairy step, a thin place where the world of men and the world of the STH overlapped like 2 pages pressed together. The last journal had been written by his uncle. And the final entry read, "I have locked the door and I am leaving tomorrow. Do not open it, Finlay. It knows your name. It has always known your name. It chose you before you were born." It's Finlay with a stubbornness that was pure Macrae. Decided that none of this could be real, that his uncle had suffered from dementia, that the whole thing was a psychological echo of isolation and suggestion. And he took a crowbar to the iron sheet and the 3 deadbolts and swung the door open. The Gable room was empty except for a single object in the center of the floor, a cradle made of woven willow branches, impossibly old but perfectly preserved, and inside it a stone that was smooth and black and warm to the touch, stone that hummed with the same frequency he'd been hearing in the static. And when he picked it up, the whispers stopped, and the house went absolutely silent, and the light outside the window changed to that cold blue pulse, and he saw reflected in the glass a figure standing behind him, tall and thin, with skin like birch bark, and eyes that were the color of a peat bog. And it was smiling at him with a mouth that had too many teeth, each one a tiny polished stone. and it placed a hand on his shoulder that felt like the weight of centuries and said, in a voice that was the whisper of grass and the crackle of ice, "You've let us out, Finlay, but don't worry, we were never really locked in. We're just waiting for someone to invite us further." He dropped the stone and it shattered on the floorboards, and the figure folded into itself like paper burning and was gone. And the light returned to a normal gray. And Finlay ran from the house and didn't stop until he was on the ferry at Oog, the cliffs of Skye receding into the mist. But the presence didn't stay in the Gable room. It followed him, as it had followed every Macrae who unsealed the door. A cold spot that moved through his flat in Glasgow. A whisper in the corner of his ear during work calls. A shadow that pooled in the corner of his bedroom and watched with patient, ancient eyes. He told me that the most terrifying part is not that it's malevolent, it doesn't seem to wish him harm, but that it's curious, and it's learning, and it sometimes wears the faces of people he loves in his dreams, asking him questions about the world outside the thin place, and he knows that one day it won't need an invitation anymore. The house of the fairies is still standing on Skye, still empty. And the Gable room door is open, and the locals say that on certain nights you can see a blue light pulsing in the window and hear the sound of a cradle rocking. And if you listen closely, you can hear a voice that was once Finlay's whispering things that no human tongue should know. Still learning, still waiting, still inviting. And there it is, 3 cracks in the world. 3 ordinary people who stepped into the wrong reflection, the wrong road, the wrong room, and came out the other side carrying something that will never let them go. Harlan still can't look into a mirror without seeing a smile that isn't his. Zara still sees that dusty track unfold on her GPS screen, calling her back. Finlay still feels cold fingers on his shoulder when he tries to sleep. These stories aren't here to scare you for a few minutes. They're here to remind you that the line between our world and the unseen is thinner than you think, and it's drawn right through the places you feel safest. If these accounts unsettled something deep inside you, then you understand why I do this. The dark needs witnesses. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which story will follow you into your dreams tonight? And if you've lived through something unexplainable, tell me. Your truth might be the next one I tell. Hit like with conviction, subscribe with that bell, and keep your eyes open. The world is full of thin places, and they're always watching. This team pours their heart and sleepless nights into every script, every sound, every whispered word. If you felt this deep in your bones, please show your love. A simple like fuels us more than you know. Subscribe now and join a community that doesn't look away from the dark. I'll see you in the next one.